Hello everyone, welcome to my thesis presentation. The title of my project is Psychosocial Factors Related to COVID-19 Vaccine Hesitancy, a Systematic Review. So before we get into the specifics of my project, I just wanted to note that both my project and this PowerPoint follow PRISMA guidelines. PRISMA guidelines just being a way of reporting systematic and meta-analytic reviews. The acronym is spelled out there if you'd like to read it. And it is broken down into 7 sections, and we will work our way through those. So for the introduction, I wanted to state both my rationale and my objectives. So for the rationale, a vaccine for any disease is only effective if it is accepted, and so it is important that we understand the factors relating to that acceptance. And so leading into the next point, which is that vaccine hesitancy is a social issue. And so in order to mitigate it, we must first understand the psychosocial factors that relate to it and contribute to it. And then finally, there are very few review articles that exist on this topic in specific, mainly due to the novelty of it, and so I am contributing to the literature in that way. And then moving over into the objectives, I want to identify and analyze the psychological and the socio-demographic factors that are related to COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. So that is my specific objective, and I want to do that in a manner that is systematic. So continuing on with our introduction, just some background information here. You'll see a definition of vaccine hesitancy. So there are a few out there, but this is the most commonly cited one, and this is from the SAGE working group that was employed by the WHO in 2014 to understand vaccine hesitancy better. And so they give the definition of vaccine hesitancy refers to delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccine services. And so even though vaccines might be available, there are personal reasons why individuals either delay receiving one or refuse one entirely. And so just some points I want to bring up here. Vaccine hesitancy is not the same thing as anti-vaccination. And so to give an example to explain that, an individual can be hesitant but can ultimately accept a vaccine, whereas individuals that identify as anti-vaccination refuse all vaccines, and then it is typically taken a step further where they associate vaccines with, for example, conspiratorial beliefs. And so they are adamantly opposed to vaccination, whereas someone that is hesitant might just have concerns or questions about it before they fully commit to it. So it's important to point that out. Additionally, in 2019, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared vaccine hesitancy as one of the major threats to global health, the top 10. And then finally, there are numerous factors that contribute to hesitancy. It is a complex, multi-dimensional social problem, and this PowerPoint and my project, despite it being a systematic review, does not do a justice to understand the breadth and the scope of all the factors that play into vaccine hesitancy. And so what you are seeing here is also from that same SAGE working group that was employed by the WHO. And this is a matrix table of the determinants of vaccine hesitancy. So you can see that they broke it down into three main categories. The first one in blue being contextual influences, the second one in red being the individual and group influences, and the last one in green being vaccine specific issues. Again, this is from 2014. There have been updates since then, but this is the latest report, and this is the model that my systematic review is following. Specifically, I'm focusing on the first two categories, so the one in blue and red, the contextual and the individual and group influences. The reason being is that those are most closely related to the psychosocial factors, whereas the last one, the vaccine issues, aren't necessarily explained by some social scientific paradigm. And so moving on into the methods, I conducted a search on March 14th of this year using the CalU Mandarino Library website. I included 6 databases, the main characters here being APA Psych Info, Medline Complete, and Soc Index, but all 6 are listed there. For the search terms included, I broke it down into 2 separate search fields. So the first one being about COVID-19, and so you'll see all of the terms listed before that and sign are just related to COVID-19 or coronavirus in some way, just so I could include as many articles as I could. And then everything after the and sign relates to vaccine hesitancy. And so 2 separate search fields and numerous search terms, just so I made sure that I could get as many articles as possible. And finally, I'm going over the limitations. All of the results were limited to journal articles, so empirical research studies. They were limited also to dates ranging from 2019 to 2020, seeing that that is when the coronavirus pandemic hit. And then finally, both the search terms in the first search field as well as the second search field were limited to the abstract of the article. My thinking there is that if some search term in both the first field and the second field, so relating to COVID-19 and vaccine hesitancy, if that is somewhere not to be found in the abstract, then it is probably not an article that I am interested in for this review. Continuing on with the methods, my inclusion criteria is pretty general. Any article that has a major focus on the psychosocial factors related specifically to the COVID-19 vaccine and how those factors relate to vaccine hesitancy. For the exclusion criteria, it's a bit more specific. So simply any article that was not relevant to that topic was excluded. Some articles did find their way into the final pool of articles, and so those were excluded. Also, any article that was not an empirical article type. So these would be review articles, commentaries, clinical opinions and guidelines. Any of those were also excluded because my systematic review is solely focused on original empirical research. And then finally, any article that did not have a major focus on either the COVID-19 vaccine or vaccine hesitancy, as well as the psychosocial factors. If that wasn't a major portion of the research, then it was also excluded. For the review process, all of the articles were exported to an Excel file, and they were coded based on that matrix table that we saw earlier. And it is important that I note the bias involved. So I was the only researcher involved in this study. That is not typical of a systematic review. There are usually at least 2 researchers to review the articles to limit the amount of bias. But just given the nature of this project, I'm the sole author. But you should know that I received and I am continually receiving guidance and feedback from my committee members. And so the breakdown of the results, using those search terms and the databases that I listed previously, there were 518 total results. After I applied those limitations, the number went down to 122, and so that was the number I ultimately reviewed in the end, and the number of articles that I exported to that Excel file. And then after reviewing all of those articles, only 48 of them were actually included in my final paper. And so the breakdown below that, 21 articles were assigned to the contextual influences, that main category, again referring to that matrix, and then 27 articles were assigned to the individual and group influences category of that matrix. And that means that 74 articles were excluded ultimately from that final 122. And so getting into what the articles talked about and what I found in my review, focusing first on the contextual influences, gender was a major factor, and the results were different depending on the article. And so in some studies, males were more likely to be hesitant, and in others, females were more likely to be hesitant. There were not articles that talked about non-binary individuals and or transgender individuals. So that information was left out, but you should know that gender was a significant factor regardless of the direction it went. Similarly with age, a different result depending on the article, but typically what was found was that individuals older in age, specifically older than the age of 50, were less likely to be hesitant. And then moving on to race and ethnicity, minority cultures, minority races were typically more likely to express hesitancy, and that could be for a number of reasons. They were not specifically discussed in the articles, but lack of representation in healthcare as well as previous negative experiences with healthcare providers are possible reasons and are explored in other articles. Socioeconomic status, so those from lower income households as well as those who possess a lower level of education were more likely to be hesitant to receive a vaccine. And then the taboo topic of politics. Only a few articles focused on this, but they all reported the same result of conservative individuals were more likely to be hesitant as opposed to more liberal individuals. Social media, this is a factor that isn't necessarily a personal characteristic, but is rather viewed as a medium through which hesitancy is spread and is learned. And then finally, distrust in pharmaceutical companies as well as governmental organizations is also a major correlate of vaccine hesitancy. And so moving on into individual and group influences, so this is more of social psychological factors. Previous vaccination history, specifically individuals that received a flu vaccine, were more likely to receive a COVID vaccine. And then a factor known as intellectual humility, which is essentially understanding the limits of one's intellect, was again associated with a higher willingness to vaccinate. Risk perception, whether this relates to risk of contracting COVID-19 or risk of side effects of receiving a COVID-19 vaccine, was also correlated to hesitancy. Conspiratorial beliefs generally were negatively related to vaccine acceptance, so the more conspiracy theories one believes in, the less likely they are to receive a vaccine. Health anxiety, again, this could be related to anxiety about contracting COVID-19 or anxiety about the side effects or the possible adverse reactions to a vaccine. Either way, it was related to vaccine hesitancy. And then scientific reasoning, as well as one's ability to accurately and objectively appraise news, is also a correlate. And then finally, there are various personality traits, such as agreeableness, that have significant correlations to vaccine hesitancy. And so, to kind of conclude with all of this, there are many psychological and socio-demographic factors related to vaccine hesitancy as it relates to COVID-19 vaccines. Again, this systematic review is not an exhaustive list of them. And then, although this review focused on the psychosocial factors, you should know that there are general factors, which the WHO matrix table lists as vaccine-specific issues. And those are concerns about side effects of the vaccine, possible adverse reactions, the novelty of the technology used in the vaccine, as well as the speed at which the vaccine was developed. All of those are common factors that aren't necessarily best explained by a social science, but are shared by individuals across these studies. Limitations of this study. The vast majority of the articles included in this study were conducted before any vaccines existed and or available to the public. And then my specific search results and my specific limitations to those results may have been limiting, and articles may have been omitted in error as a result. And finally, future directions. Research should focus on this same issue, but after the fact, the vaccine is now available and widely distributed to the public. We should see what the psychosocial factors are currently and how that affects hesitancy. And then finally, research is needed to come up with effective interventions to combat and mitigate vaccine hesitancy. And so just some additional information here. I do not receive any financial funding for this project. I declare no conflicts of interest. This PowerPoint, as well as a copy of my paper, is available upon request, and you can see my email there. Just send me an email. I'd be happy to provide it to you. For the acknowledgements, I would like to thank my committee members, which includes Drs. Larson from the Sociology Department, Hackett from the Psychology Department, and Press from the Philosophy Department, as well as my research librarian, Lauren Prest, and of course, Dr. Fox from the Honors Department. And so thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned something about the topic. If you have any questions or comments, additional feedback, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to start a conversation with that, as well as provide you with any additional information. And I will end with my references. And again, a full list used in the paper is available upon request. Thank you so much for listening.